I hope everyone's doing well today, and it's given a chance for people to give us a chance to join us. We've got a lot to cover, in a little bit of time. So I am grateful and I am appreciative of your time. And so we are going to get the best bang for your buck. Okay. With that, we're going to talk about some few ground rules which you may not be aware of with our seminars. So when we do a webinar, you're going to see lots of data on the screen. That's important. The reason for that is because you've been told a lot of information that is not accurate or consistent with the standard. So what I provide for you is to provide the maximum amount of information along with the citation relative to the things that I'm telling you about. If people tell you things and they cannot show you where those things are or provide a citation about that information, you should not believe them. And that includes me. Okay, so what I will try to do is I will try to highlight the information that's important to you. And then you're not possibly going to be able to absorb it all. So pay attention to what I say when you're writing notes and so on and so forth. Okay. We're gonna also keep a session at the end for questions, and I'm gonna stay as long as it takes to answer all your questions. Okay. So with that, make sure that you write your questions down. Okay, and then we'll put them in the Q&A after we're done. All right. So be prepared. Take a deep breath. Okay, and the amount of information that I provide you is not meant to overwhelm you, but it is meant to provide you a resource for you to go back to and review over a given period of time. All right. That's the reason why we provide as much information as we do. Now, the content that we provide you has literally thousands of hours into it. I literally have, if I presented the entire CUI topic in its entirety, it would be well over 1,000 slides. Okay. It is deep and complex. And what we're talking about is CUI marking today, but we can't get to marking until we prep the objective, so to speak, and give you the appropriate background information to undo the inaccurate information that you likely believe to be true. So the content that we're providing you, we ask is authorized for your individual use. I will tell you, and we certainly welcome you to take screenshots of the content. The slides in themselves will not be provided for you. All right. The reason why we do that is because we want you to take a screenshot of the things that are important to you. All right. And then, so take screenshots. Okay. But please demonstrate integrity, and please recognize our commitment to you and providing this information at no charge. Okay. And in us providing this information, excuse me, there is a two-way communication and a relationship that we have, which we ask you to be a good steward of our intellectual property. Okay. And share this information, and do not reuse this information for your own commercial use. We love and we welcome other folks within the CMC ecosystem. You can certainly ask questions. I don't care where you're from. That doesn't matter. You may be another consultant or any of that. None of that matters. We are here to help train and educate you to understand these requirements with certainty. So we absolutely welcome you to participate that. And we're also going to provide some additional content and a follow-up email from some recent briefs that I recently did on CMC 2.0, and I'll highlight those. All right. So yes, we do advisory work. This is what we do at DTC Global, and this is what we specialize in. We do nothing else but this, literally compliance-driven digital transformation. And so we offer these, and we welcome and love other consultants in the space. And that is the principle for which we founded the CMMC Industry Standards Council, which I'll talk about in a second. My background is literally built upon my entire adult life in service to my nation, and I view this in simply another capacity to that. Okay, yes, in the small scheme of things, there are other consultants who we compete with in business. There are very few of those, but the reality is this is a gigantic blue ocean. This is the largest opportunity to help secure our nation in the history of my lifetime and maybe in the history of our nation. And we are going to be a good steward of that opportunity to help train and educate as many people as possible. That is our goal. And so we do that in events like this, and we do that through the CMMC Industry Standards Council, where like-minded experts come together to try and to provide clarity and certainty about a standard which is muddled with inconsistent and inaccurate information. All right. So this CMMC Industry Standards Council was founded after I left the cyber accreditation body, and it is intended and does provide as much clarity and as much certainty about these requirements. We do not, it is not a self-licking ice cream cone organization, in the sense that our job isn't to take credit for all the things that we do within the ecosystem. We are very fortunate and appreciative of the fact that we are trusted advisors within the DoD, within the CMMC ecosystem. And so our job is not to take credit for every single little thing that we do and contribute to. Our job is to ensure that the maximum opportunity to impart accurate and consistent information is at our disposal, and we take advantage of that, and that trust and confidence that those folks who reach out to us have. So I urge you to go up to the CMMC Industry Standards Council. That's a small representation on industrystandardscouncil.org, and that's it is a 501c6, and that is a small representation of many organizations out there who we are grateful to have contribute to that, and have since the beginning of the accreditation body through the CMMC industry working group. So recently I did a review, and Brian will reach out to you and follow up with a link to this, and once we get it posted, about the CMMC 2.0 rule. We are not going to touch on the rule and very much at all, except at the very end. I'm going to highlight things about it, but the rule details are very intricate, and so we dedicate an entire episode to that. Today we're talking about marking and then the contextual information related to marking. With that, though, I am going to highlight something that the DoD has done an excellent job at. They provide a 40-minute presentation about the CMMC model and the certification underneath CMMC 2.0 at the link that's there. And I highly recommend that you take the time to listen to every word that they provide. It is an excellent and well done, well cited, and accurate, because sometimes, we're human, so we make mistakes. And I am consistently surprised with the quality of the CMMC rule and the quality of the presentation work that's coming out of the DoD. It really is. They've done an excellent job, and you need to take advantage of this unique opportunity to digest the things that they tell you about the basic concepts on the rule. Okay, so we are going to cover today what is CUI. Okay, and we're also going to cover, is this CUI? Okay, because if you don't know what CUI is, and you're not sure if this is CUI, then marking doesn't do us any good, does it? Okay. We're also going to cover how and where do we find our CUI? Okay, because that's also critical for your understanding. And then lastly, we're going to cover how do we establish a controlled area, because a controlled area is the cornerstone for these requirements. So there's a process that DTC Global calls the CUI discovery process. And that process is intended, although it's not listed in the actual Standard 171 or 171 Alpha, okay, or mentioned in the CMMC 2.0 rule, which would be a great idea. It is the process for which you go through your organization and you identify where your CUI is and what it is and where it's at and who receives it and how does it impact your products and services that you're providing in performance of your contract throughout your people, throughout your manufacturing process and your business workflow, and how that either aligns or does not align with the IT systems and the requirements that you're expected to meet. It is the cornerstone for everything that you're going to do or fix or undo, unfortunately, for some or for many, in trying to align your environment with these requirements. much of what you have done over the past 2 years will not be effective. I hate to say that, but that I'm going to rip off the Band-Aid because we say this with the greatest affection and empathy, that most of the things that people have done over the last 2 years are not accurate and consistent with the standard. And I really am sorry that that's true, but it is true. And so you're going to have to take the time to relearn what you think you know to ensure that you are as accurate and as consistent with the standard as possible so that you do not waste your time after another eight or 10 months of really, really hard work to think you're crossing the finish line to discover tragically that you are nowhere near that finish line. So that you can understand that process in the CMC 2.0 briefing that we'll provide over email. All right. So controlled areas. Everything about the NIST 800-171 requirements and CMMC certification is intended to establish a controlled area, and everything in that area be controlled and be and meet the requirements to protect CUI. Every single thing, people, process, technology, systems, the facility itself, everything in that facility is intended in order to protect the CUI and the performance of the contract. You must establish an area or space which the organization has confidence meet the physical and procedural protections provided, and that they're sufficient to meet the requirements related to CUI and the types and categories of CUI that you have in your environment, and in order to meet this the security requirements for that within that facility and in the information system that's protecting that. So that is a comprehensive definition for everything. It is for our facilities, for our people, for our IT systems, for the work areas, for the business flow, for our machines that produce CUI, okay, and in performance of the contract, that do the actual work and performance of the contract. Everything is intended to meet requirements, and that is the bottom line for NIST 800-171 and for the CMC certification standard. How do we do that? We do that by controlling the flow of CUI. We have to understand where our CUI is, how to identify our CUI, how to locate where our CUI is, and mark it properly. Then we isolate that wherever it is and wherever we need it to be that's necessary to meet requirements. And we restrict everything that cannot or does not meet requirements or is prohibited from accessing that CUI. We do that by implementing the safeguards that are required to protect CUI, okay? We monitor that environment in the physical world and in the virtual world, and to ensure that we can enforce the appropriate controls that are necessary to safeguard that CUI in the physical world and in the virtual world. And we must have the proper documentation, and we must have the proper, adequate, and sufficient evidence to prove it. That is everything that you must do in a nutshell. And certainly, the devil is in the details, folks. Okay? Now, if this approach is new to you, then that's good. I'm glad that we're here together. But at the end of the day, the things that you must do represent everything that I'm going to tell you in this brief and everything I will ever tell you, whether you're paying me or not. Okay? So that is rooted in the standard. It's rooted in the requirements, and we will travel this world, this mountain that we have to climb together. Okay? And I'm very empathetic to the difficulty that you're facing in order to execute this and do this within all of the job and responsibilities that are necessary to do, that continue to go on, because we work in businesses and we have to continue our contract performance. But it's absolutely critical that you understand these requirements with clarity and that you can do this with certainty so that you're not undoing the hard work that you've already done. So when we talk about marking in particular, we always talk about the primary reference. Yes, it is the CUI marking aid. Okay, that the representation of that should be from the September 3rd, 2020 edition or version of the document that you see on the right. However, in the context of the requirements we're going to talk about today, you must understand the 32 CFR, the CUI registry, or the DoD CUI registry, the CUI notices that are applicable to you, your CUI, and all of them are always applicable to the DoD agency first, and then to you, and we'll get into why. The DoD policies and policy guidance all apply to you, and that starts with the DFARS 7012 contract clause. That goes to the PGI guidance, and if you're not familiar with the PGI guidance, I will show you why it's important. Okay, the DoD 885 82.01, the DoD procurement toolbox cybersecurity FAQ is absolutely critical. It is standing DoD policy. Okay, what they tell you, you can execute with confidence that is exactly the way you should do it. DoD Instruction 5248 is the defining document for all controlled and classified information for everyone, and that includes you. That includes me. Okay, and the 5230.24, which is the defining cornerstone document for understanding what controlled technical information is, and you'll understand very quickly why that's so important. Underneath the DoD CUI marking guide, now we begin to apply this information that we know in the context of the DoD CUI marking guide, because we have to do this in accordance with the DoD assessment methodology V.2.1 to get our accurate and reliable SPRS score, and to have the appropriate adequate and sufficient evidence in order to meet these requirements and substantiate that. There are also references related to the NIST 800 171 and 171 alpha, and you should always use those primary references. And I highly, with greatest caution and greatest concern, do not recommend that you use the CMC assessment guide. And there are reasons for that I cover in the CMC 2.0 the CMC 2.0 briefing. So I will not go into them now, but trust me that they are absolutely reliable and in high standards for why you should only use the primary references. And I talk about that in detail within the CMC 2.0. The DIBCAC website is an excellent website, though it doesn't include all of the CMC 2.0 underneath the latest CMC rule, the latest versions of those documents. So please be careful and don't use the older versions of the CMC documents. If you choose to use them, you should, in my humble opinion, you should only use the CMC scoping guide and the CMC glossary. And again, I cover that in the CMC 2.0 CMC War Room brief that you will get a link to. All of the CMC 2.0 references you should absolutely pay heed and attention to, because they incorporate them for a reason. All right, what you should not use. Google is not your friend, folks. Google is not your friend. The vast majority of every single reference that you're going to go to in every single control, including marking, is not going to give you the appropriate information in order to meet these requirements, folks. It's not gonna, okay? So with greatest concern, please be careful of anything and any term and any reference and any control that you search for. If you use the NIST 800 Handbook 162 in order to meet these requirements in the beginning, that has been shelved, and there's a reason for that, because there are substantial errors within that document, believe it or not, okay? And it is oversimplistic, and so is the CMC assessment guide examples, in which the CMC model document plainly states that the examples that are provided for you will not meet requirements. Okay, so and neither will you follow the NIST Handbook 162. Do not use the emergency resources, and do not use the examples. They are overly simplistic, and in my humble opinion, they should not be contained within the CMC assessment guide in any version. Remember that if you're high speed and you think that ChatGPT is going to be your friend, I can assure you, through spending a good amount of time correcting ChatGPT and doing my research about how accurate and consistent it is, that remember that ChatGPT aggregates the information that's available to you on the open internet. The problem is that the vast majority of information on the open internet is not accurate. And there are many various reasons for that. Now, if you love to watch the Trailer Park Roundup, you can go to LinkedIn, right, and watch, so-called experts, name call each other and act like total heathens. But I highly recommend that you do not do this. Most of what they tell you is inaccurate. And what most of what they argue about is not meaningful to you. Okay, so they're arguing about either wrongly, or they're arguing about the head of the pin instead of looking at what information is going to help you actually meet requirements and ensuring what they say is accurate and consistent with the standard. And my friends, unfortunately, that's not a priority on LinkedIn. So I urge you to avoid LinkedIn at all costs, because it will only undo what you're trying to do. If you want accurate and consistent information, I would urge you to go to CMC Industry Standards Council.org and submit a question. If you have a question, we have 80 something stakeholders that participate that, and they are the best at what they do. All right. With that, the DFCAC website is an excellent resource for you to go to. And the reason for that is because it will rip the Band-Aid off on what you believe is adequate and sufficient evidence in order to meet these requirements. It is highly, highly, highly detailed policies, procedures, and evidence that is required in order to pass a DFCAC, a DoD assessment, or to pass a CMC assessment. Okay, so you can go down to the additional resources. I urge you to download the information that the DFCAC provides for you. And I also urge you to go through the DFCAC video, which is a really great video, by the way. And about the 2-minute mark, 2 minutes, 17 seconds, I believe, off the top of my head, it will tell you a simple truth, which is that organizations within the defense industrial base will create far more CUI than they will actually receive. And that is a cornerstone nugget, golden nugget for you, that will be self-evident as we walk through the rest of the presentation. Why do we do the CUI discovery process? We do the CUI discovery process because it is the cornerstone of walking through what can and cannot have access to CUI. What are the essential persons, the processes, the devices, the external systems, the facilities, all within the essential capabilities that must be applied in order to perform the contract. What are those things that may have access and are permitted to have access to CUI? And what are those things that are not permitted access to CUI? Okay. So when we receive CUI and we develop CUI in performance of the contract, there's a lot going on, folks. You run your companies and you know that best. Okay. And I spent literally thousands of hours with companies out there looking at literally thousands of pieces of CUI or information that may qualify as CUI to help organizations determine how to identify CUI accurately and consistently within their business models. There's a lot going on inside of manufacturing environments. So we have to identify all the essential capabilities based on the types of CUI that you have that help you to know what is and who is permitted and able to access the CUI. Because just because I work for you doesn't mean that I'm permitted to access the CUI in performance of the contract. Okay, that's the cornerstone for why CUI discovery is so important, and why the very first two questions set us up for, okay, well, now we're going to market. Why are we protecting CUI? We are protecting CUI because if we don't, folks, we're doomed. And I wish that were hyperbole. Our enemies are exploiting our data to defeat us. Period. Okay? The things that people sell us in the dollar store will be our own doing, because they are ripping off our defense data. They are undermining the competitive advantage that our defense companies have, and they're using that data to destroy us. And they will, and they are. An example of that, which is proof and not hyperbole, folks, is this. If you want to understand why in the Ukraine that a small country, relatively small country, has fought the Russians to a standstill in some cases, okay, and why the second largest superpower in the entire world does not have air or land dominance through their weapon systems that they have. The Su-33, the Su-34, those are fighter aircraft, the T-81, the T-82 tank, right? Why are those literally being blown off the battlefield? And the answer is because those weapon systems have been exploited for the past 20 years, and there are counter weapon systems out there, and they are no longer effective on the battlefield. And if we want us to have that very, very shock and horror moment that the F-35 or some other weapon system that we spent billions of dollars in is literally being blown out of the sky like a turkey shoot, just like the Su-33 and the Su-34 are, then we can just keep on doing what we're doing, which is giving our data away to our enemies. Okay. An example of the proof is the fact that in the Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider that took $203 billion to develop over 33 years at $2 billion price tag per aircraft, the Chinese exploited that information, the supply chain, that's me and you, and the performance of your contract to rip off that data. And within 15 years, they put an aircraft of their version of that aircraft on the tarmac before we released ours. Okay. Not only does that give them a competitive advantage against us because they can reproduce our technology at a cheaper price, but the fact that they're exploiting our technology to understand the vulnerabilities to create the exact same scenario that we are that the Ukrainians are taking advantage of and blowing the Russian tanks and aircraft literally right off the battlefield. Okay. Our job, folks, and I take this egregious and egregiously serious, that our job is to protect CUI. That is a moral imperative as far as I'm concerned, because when we protect our CUI, we protect our warfighters who protect us. And if we do not protect that CUI, folks, our warfighters are and will continue to be at severe risk. And we are going to find out in the most ugliest and worst of times the truth in that statement. So we have a moral imperative to protect the CUI just like our warfighters protect us. And that's why we do what we do. So what is CUI? The cornerstone of marking. So controlled and classified information, as many of you may know, is developed and created in performance of a contract on behalf of the DoD and behalf of the U.S. government. And when we create or possess that information and develop that information in performance of the contract, that is restricted, that the DoD or the U.S. government intends to be protected, then we are subject to these requirements underneath our contract clauses and underneath the statutory and regulatory policy that affects us in the performance of that contract. So when we received it on behalf of the DoD, when we created on behalf of the DoD, we are subject to all of the rules that apply to that CUI. What's important to know is that when you go to the CUI registry and when you look up controlled technical information, it tells you exactly what controlled technical information is, and it tells you exactly the resources that you need to go to identify what CUI is and what are the requirements for protecting that information, which we will review in brief during this time period. So that CUI that's developed in performance of the contract is called covered defense information, and that is a acquisition term, and that means any information that the DoD intends for you to protect in the performance of your contract that qualifies as CUI must be protected. Now, notice that I'm going to impart to you over and over and over again that it does not say marked as CUI, because marked is only one half of the equation. So if the information qualifies as CUI, you are underneath the duty and the obligation to protect it, period. Okay? And how do we know that? Because the CUI registry tells us that, because DoD instruction 8582.01 tells us that, because DoD instruction 5248 tells us that, and DoD instruction 5230.24 tells us that. Okay. And we will amplify and provide the sufficient detail to undo the misinformation that you've been provided for the last several years. How do I know that's true, Regan? I mean, the CMC rule, that's a completely different thing. It does not that all of that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is just what's in the CMC assessment guide and what's in the rule. Well, guess what the rule tells you within the 270 something pages of a very well and very detailed information. If you look at Appendix A, in the Part 170, that's the 32 CFR Part 170, which is the new CMMC rule, it will tell you in Section 20 that DoD policy applies to the implementation of the NIST Standard 171 requirements for the DFARS 7012, and DoD policy is required to be adhered to in performance of the contract and the implementation and certification process underneath the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, period. There is no ambiguity or uncertainty about that guidance within the rule itself. And I will show you why it says that if that's news to you. Okay. So it's vital and important that you realize that when I tell you that DoD policy applies to that rule or to the CMC rule and applies to the CUI, as you implement the NIST 800-171 requirements, it will provide you clarity on why I'm telling you all the things that I'm telling you broadcast. So wherever CUI flows, wherever it flows, meaning that now it lives in an unrestricted environment, likely, wherever it's going right now is what must meet requirements. The whole purpose of the contract, the whole purpose of the implementation of the requirements is to restrict the CUI, to control the flow of CUI to only those areas that are permitted. And permitted is a very important word because it's permitted as the prescribed requirements tell you. So you have to understand what the prescribed requirements are. And if you search in the CMC rule, you look for the word prescribed, which I encourage you to do, you will realize that that terminology is used consistently throughout the rule. That's important because you must know what the prescribed requirements are when you're implementing the NIST 800-171 and when you are seeking certification. The prescribed requirements applicable to the types of CUI that you have must be implemented, period. End of story. Okay? Why do we do that? Because we're protecting confidentiality, we're preventing misuse, and we're preventing the unauthorized disclosure of that information. And that applies to federal contract information as well. Okay? Federal contract information is different, and I will touch on it briefly. Federal contract information, okay, is information that isn't required to meet all of the requirements for CUI. It is not a category of CUI. It is not in the CUI registry. Okay, it is a federal contract information is information that's not in the CUI registry, that's not intended for public release. Okay, it's intended that the DoD policy says there's an expectation of confidentiality in DoD 8582.01. That expectation of confidentiality exists between the DoD and the prime contractor and all of its suppliers. Okay, so if there's an expectation of confidentiality in the performance of the contract, that information in relationship to the performance of the contract is protected as federal contract information. If the information fits or applies to a CUI category, then the information qualifies as CUI and it is not FCI. So you must protect it by all the requirements that are prescribed for that category of CUI. And that includes the 110 requirements and what DoD also says that you have to do, DoD policy. Typically, within the CUI, there are two categories of the 24, although it could apply to any of the 24 categories and 92 subcategories and 110 types. It could apply to any of them. But primarily throughout the DoD, it impacts two categories of information: controlled technical information and export controlled information. Export controlled information is highly sensitive because its enforcement regime is highly punitive. Okay, I urge you to have you should run an export control compliance advisory. That's how I started within the CUI in December in 2015. And I highly advise you to know what you're doing and to seek out wise counsel in handling export controlled information. But nevertheless, DoD policy and the DDTC policy underneath ITAR and BIS underneath EAR apply to all export controlled information that is received or created in the performance of a contract underneath the DFARS 7012 contract clause. So you have two categories of information that must be fully compliant with all the things that are required: controlled technical information and export controlled information. And that includes everything that you do with that information. Handling, by definition, incorporates every single activity that's permitted that's allowed to be done, in other words, with the CUI. That applies to every single activity for controlled technical information or export controlled information in the performance of a DoD contract. Okay. So created or possesses on or behalf of the government, folks, CUI. All right. Now, who has the responsibilities for this? Is it just my company? It's the prime contractor. It's not us. And we don't even receive marked CUI. Well, hang on. So who is responsible for handling CUI? That means any activity related to the performance of the contract that is permitted. Okay. And that includes you. You are an authorized holder. You are an individual. You are not an agency. You are an organization. And it may be considered a group of users that is permitted to designate or handle CUI in accordance with 32 CFR. Okay. You are, the reason why is because you are performing a contract for which you have been notified in the DFARS 7012 clause that you may receive or develop CUI in performance of a contract. And we'll get into the details of that. Okay. So 5248 recognizes this, in that the 5248, that's a DoD instruction, applies to everyone inside of this the DoD that is an authorized holder, and that includes you at the individual level, and that includes your organization at the organization level. So you can be held individually accountable, okay, just like the ITAR, right? You can go to jail for willful negligence within the ITAR. There's no difference between mishandling ITAR information underneath the DoD contract and mishandling ITAR information underneath a standard delivery of products and services. But guess what? There are additional things that you must do underneath DoD policy for which you are also accountable. The definition for contractor is defined both in the CMC rule, and it's also defined within the DoD instruction 5230.24. And it includes prime contractors and subcontractors. It includes all tiers explicitly stated within the CMC rule and DoD policy right now. Okay, so it's everyone, folks. It's not because I want to be, or because I want you to be and not me to be, not because I wish it weren't me, not because I wish it weren't you. None of that matters. What matters is who's ever performed the contract, who has been notified of the inclusion of the DFARS 7012 requirement that you may create CUI in performance of that contract. You are responsible and accountable for all of the requirements which apply to those categories of CUI that you create or possess in performance of a contract. So to illustrate that further, we say who can, within the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, who can create CUI? And the answer is anyone can create CUI as long as it is generated by or on behalf of the executive branch. That's the president, right? And who works for the executive branch. That's the DoD, okay? That falls into any of the over 100 categories of CUI that the DoD cares about. That is who can create CUI. So this nonsense, this absolute misinformation about the fact that you don't create CUI because you're not authorized to have CUI, you're not authorized to mark CUI, or you're not blah, 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 or you don't have marked CUI is utter nonsense, folks. And again, I will continue to reinforce this throughout this broadcast. How can you be authorized or permitted to access CUI? That's very important for you to know, because before you can access CUI, you must be eligible. And the CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policy, including DoD policy, outline what makes you permitted to access CUI, to be eligible in order to be qualified to actually handle CUI. So this is the requirements, and you should definitely take a screenshot of this, okay? And because we're not going to go through the details because we're covering so much information. But if you do not meet these criteria straight out of the requirements, and I add the sources at the bottom, folks, if you do not meet this criteria, if you are not eligible to access CUI, and I realize there's a chicken and egg problem. Well, we have CUI and we're just blowing the dust off of all of these things, but we haven't done all these things. They can be POEM items, but you have to resolve these POEM items underneath the CMC 2.0 rule, and you need to do that because you don't have very much time left, folks. To be qualified, well, okay, I'm eligible, but I'm not restricted. I'm not prohibited. Okay, great. I am permitted underneath our contract. Fantastic. How can I be qualified to access the CUI? You must do these things in order to ensure that you are qualified. And that includes being screened. That includes not being prohibited. That includes not being restricted. That includes meeting all of the training requirements. And that includes the NIST requirements as well as the mandatory CUI requirements for DOD. Okay, CUI training requirements for DOD. Okay, so you have to meet all of those requirements in order to be fully qualified to access CUI. Okay, once I am qualified, that and I've done these things, I am eligible. I am authorized. That's the reason why it says that permit only authorized individuals to access CUI. Well, you say, Regan, the NIST 800-171 doesn't tell you all these things. That's right. It doesn't. You're 100% right. Okay, so, well, if it doesn't tell me I have to do these things, then they don't apply. Nope. No, that's not true. Okay. All right. So we just want to clear that up. Just because it's in the CMMC assessment guide doesn't mean you don't have to do it. That's just a simple fact. Okay. I mean, are we in agreement here? And I will show you. I'm being a little bit satirical, but that's what people tell me, and they say these things with a straight face. I'm telling you right now, and I'm showing you, more importantly, not just telling you why what people have said over and over and over again is neither accurate nor consistent with the standard. All right. And I know this hurts. I do. And I know it's difficult because you have to do a bunch of things that no one's told you about. I understand. Okay. I do. Why is what I'm saying accurate and consistent with the standard? Why is this not about Regan being right and other people being wrong? I don't care about other people being wrong, nor actually me being right. What I care about is the fact that doing my homework to know what I can tell you that is accurate and consistent with the standard. The 32 CFR 200.214 safeguarding section that says the general safeguarding policy, which applies to all authorized holders underneath the definition, says that you must comply with the 32 CFR, you must comply with the CUI registry, and you must comply with all agency policies that are applicable and any additional instructions. Okay. You must comply with any type of CUI that you have in your environment, export controlled information that's designated as CUI. That's the reason it's your responsibility to do that, and I'll show you why. And you must follow the appropriate policies and regulations that apply to that information. So if it's controlled technical information, you must follow all DoD policy that applies to controlled technical information. If you have export controlled information, you must follow all policies that apply to the export controlled information. And you must also apply underneath DoD policy the information or the policies that apply to CUI underneath DoD policy as well, in addition to, okay, not in substitution of. All right. Protecting CUI underneath the authorized holder requires you to do very important things, okay, to prevent unauthorized disclosure. You must, guess what? Number one, establish controlled environments. That's the reason we started with the introduction, because very likely you've never even heard of a controlled environment before. You've never even seen the definition for controlled environment. That's why we started there, folks, okay? To be accurate and consistent with the requirements, not what people have told you, all right? So we have to establish a controlled environment to prevent and protect from unauthorized access. And only in a controlled environment are we permitted to access CUI, okay? So we have to ensure that we have to have a reasonable expectation that people cannot access or observe CUI or overhear conversations discussing CUI. We have to keep a CUI in the direct control of the authorized holder and must keep it at least one physical barrier, okay, from the protection against a restricted user or a prohibited user or a prohibited person, right, from accessing that CUI. So we cannot allow people who are restricted or prohibited or not eligible or not qualified to access the CUI under number 3. Our job is to protect the confidentiality of CUI and to implement what in our IT system and any other IT system that doesn't belong to the government, that's involved in the performance of the contract underneath the NIST 800-171 requirements and all the other requirements as well. Okay. So our responsibility as an authorized holder is to execute these things and just these four are likely to be news to you. And if they are, please put that in the comments, okay? Because it's important for me to gauge on whether or not you've heard any of these things. If you've never heard of this, then that's important for me to know. And that's also feedback to continue to get into the level of detail that we're getting into in order for you to understand the requirements, because that's important to me. So number two, is this CUI? That's a great question. So now understand what is CUI. Now we're looking at, is this CUI? Cool. Let's talk about designating. Why does it matter if this is CUI or not? The reason why is because look at the definition for designating CUI. That is the obligation of every authorized holder underneath the 32 CFR. People will make the argument or statement, probably is better, that, well, you're not authorized to mark CUI. That's utter nonsense, folks. It's an explicit requirement in the NIST 800-171. Mark CUI media. Mark CUI media. Well, media means that's just the hard drive. No, my friends, it is not just the hard drive. People don't understand the definition of media when they tell you that. Where does the definition of media come from? FIPS 199, folks. FIPS 200. Okay. So when people say to you, if you've had a consultant or an outside person say to you, well, that CUI media, that's just the hard drive. No, my friends, they do not know that what the information that they're relaying to you is not accurate and consistent with the standard. That's the reason I'm telling you this now. All right. So designating CUI is the responsibility of every authorized holder. It is explicit within the definition of designating CUI in the 3200 part 2002 4 section T. Okay. The authorized holder is responsible for designating the CUI. The reason why is because you are responsible for ensuring the recipients are aware of the status of the information that you've designated as CUI so that they can protect it according to the requirements. That's the reason why we mark CUI. That's the reason why you're not allowed to not mark CUI, okay? And people will tell you, you're not allowed to mark CUI. There is not a single DOD mention that restricts you from marking CUI. Not a single one. Not in any policy. And I've read them all hundreds of times. And I'm going to show you the, in fact, opposite is true, where DOD policy explicitly tells you that you're responsible for marking. Now, if you receive a piece of CUI that is not marked accurately, you can challenge it underneath the 32 CFR. In my humble opinion, folks, that's a complete waste of time. Treat it as CUI and drive on. In the speed of business, you cannot afford the meat grinder. And I've never actually heard of somebody going through the entire process of challenging CUI. It's really not worth your effort. The idea is protect the information, not protect the information. Okay. So what about unmarked CUI? Okay. Well, guess what? The 32 CFR deals with this. So the lack of CUI marking on the information that qualifies as CUI, notice qualifies, and does not exempt the authorized holder, that's you and me, from abiding by the applicable handling requirements. That's any activity related to the CUI as described, that's permitted, as described in the 32 CFR on the CUI registry. So the lack of a CUI marking does not exempt you from not handling it exactly as you should, which includes marking, folks, because that's in the definition of designating. That's in the direct policy guidance from the DoD, and I will show you that policy guidance. And in the DoD procurement toolbox, it does tell you, and that's important for you to know, that the DoD cybersecurity toolbox gives you direction to ask the DoD. Okay, that's good, but the reality is that that's not practical. Okay, that's just the truth. If I'm a tier 17 sub, when am I ever going to talk to my prime? That doesn't happen. Most subcontractors are scared to death of their primes, right? So the reality is that you need to know what your responsibilities are, and you need to execute that. And listen, that the DoD, I will show you where the DoD policy allows for the fact that you may get it wrong. That's not the issue. You will get it wrong if you do not mark CUI information that qualifies as CUI, and it is CUI. You will get that wrong. So the originating authority always has the duty and responsibility to inform the CUI. But look at that supply chain, folks. from the originating authority, the DoD, to the prime contractor, down to the 17 tier sub, you'll likely that some of that information falls off the plate and isn't informed. Yes, that's right. So the reality is that the originating authority does mark their CUI. They do tell the prime contractor, but very often that's lost in translation in the distribution of that information amongst thousands, literally, and sometimes tens of thousands of tier suppliers. And the contracting officer is the least likely person to be helpful in understanding what CUI is, in my experience. It's not that they don't want to help, it's that they don't know. It's not their job to tell you, by the way. Okay, so again, within the DoD FAQ, it says, how do we know what covered defense information is? And the DoD says in reply to that, yes, it should be identified in the contract if you're from a DoD to a prime contractor within this specific session. Sometimes that's true. Oftentimes it's not. And when that contract is passed on, that information is lost in the matrix. And yes, according to DoD policy, the requiring activity, meaning from the prime contractor down to the lower tier subs, and from the higher tier subs to the lower tier subs, should mark the information. That's great. But in reality, though, that really doesn't happen. And that does not exempt you from either the liability or the responsibility to do this, because that's the cornerstone of all the requirements, is to properly mark CUI and to protect it accordingly. And just so those naysayers out there who say that DFARS 7012 doesn't tell you that, of course it does. And the PGI guidance, which is the guidance from the contracting officer to the prime contractor who receives the original contract, it says explicitly, word for word, like I literally screenshot this. Notice my little icon up on top. I literally screenshot this right off of the webpage. The originator of a communication or documentation is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether or not information in a communication or documentation falls into a CUI category. It literally says that word for word. So there is absolutely no truth nor accuracy to the guidance that people give you that you don't have the authority. You actually have the obligation, because DoD policy explicitly tells you that. Within the DoD Manual 5200.01, Volume 4, which governs the handling of CUI, it says the originator of the document is responsible for determining at origination whether or not the information may qualify in the CUI status, and if so, apply the appropriate CUI markings. That documentation is and policy is applicable to every single person within the DoD, because that's what the scope of applicability of the document says. All right. And lastly, well, what if I get it wrong? I'm scared, right? What if I get it wrong? That this is how DoD policy recognizes the fact that your intentions may not be accurate. Okay. It's not an issue. Do you think that the DoD is going to punish you for getting it wrong? Not through preventing others from having it, but getting it wrong because you were vigilant, right? And you got something wrong, that you marked it as CUI when it really was FCI. No, they do not care. Do they care about the fact that you did not mark the CUI at all? You betcha. You betcha. The originator of the document is responsible for determining at the origination, right? Exactly what I just told you, whether the information might qualify for CUI status, and if so, apply the appropriate CUI markings. However, this responsibility does not preclude the competent authority, meaning the DoD officials higher in the chain of command or functional experts, from modifying the markings. Okay, so the originating authority always has the duty and obligation to review the information if you've marked it and they receive it and it's not accurate or consistent. All right, that's it. That's the bottom line. The originator shall be notified if it changes. So if you mark it in your organization and you originated the CUI, which is likely because you'll develop far more CUI than you'll receive, and it's not the appropriate marking, and it gets back to the DoD has the obligation to notify you that, hey, look, this isn't quite right. Let me tell you what is right. Okay. Why is that true? That's true because the actual definition for covered defense information is defined as you see on the right-hand side. It is CUI that's marked or otherwise identified in the contract and provided to a non-DoD entity by or on behalf of the DoD in support of the performance of contract, grant, or legal agreement. That's part A. Or, not and, or it is collected and developed, received, transmitted, used, and stored by or on behalf of the non-DoD entity in support of the performance of the contract, which means that the actual DoD contract clause underneath the DFARS 7012 provisions you for the fact that you will create CUI in performance of the contract. And it is and grants you the authority to do so because you have to be permitted, right? And so that's the reason why it's included within the actual definition of covered defense information for the DFARS 7012 contract. On the left-hand side, you may or may not receive CUI that's properly marked. Okay, but nevertheless, you have duties and obligations, whether you receive that information or whether you we develop that information to proceed and handle that information according to the requirements in 32 CFR, which include marking. So let's talk about that. Underneath the cornerstone document for covered defense information about what is controlled technical information. Great, Regan, you told me about what is CUI, but I need to get more in the details, and we're going to do that. So underneath the cornerstone document for what is CUI, that is controlled technical information underneath the DFARS 7012, is actually defined in the CUI registry in the paragraph at the very bottom. It tells you this is the general definition for controlled technical information, and if you need to know what document you need to reference in order to know whether or not it's controlled technical information, go to the DoD 5230.24. And the DoD 5248 says that controlled technical information will be described and detailed within the DoDI 5230.24, which a newest version of that, don't use the old version, was released in January 2023. Okay? So in 2023, the DoD gave you an absolutely outstanding document to guide you on what is and is not controlled technical information. And it is the end, it is the alpha and the omega of the definition of what is controlled technical information and what qualifies as controlled technical information and what you should do with it. And that's where we start in number 3. Okay? So in number 3, okay, we talk about how and where do we find our CUI. So, okay, well, this document that she's looking at on her screen, okay, yep, it meets the definition for what we say. It's been performance of the DoD contract. It's a bunch of technical gobbledygook. Now, where is that information? Okay, well, and what is that information? So where and the what are both of those are very important. So let's get into the details of what qualifies as controlled technical information so we can identify where that information is. All right. So when we look at what is CUI, we start with the CUI registry, always. We look at DoD policy, always. We look at the contract clause itself, always. And then we go to DoD policy as what is controlled technical information, because DoD policy tells you to do that in 5248. That defining document, as I mentioned, is 5230.24. And then when we perform the contract, we use these resources of information to identify what is CUI, what is controlled information, technical information, what qualifies as controlled technical information, so that we can control the flow of that controlled technical information in performance of the contract in order to meet the requirements. So what DTC Global does is we identify these people as CUI stakeholders, because if you leave it to IT to figure all this out and to get you compliant, you are wasting your time. The actual part is that notice that the cog that circles around the information technology resources is much smaller than the core business functions that handle, create, and develop CUI every single day in the performance of the contract. We must marry these two together in order to protect CUI and fully meet the requirements underneath the DFARS 7012 and, of course, for CMMC. So all of the stakeholders that are involved in handling the CUI, receiving the CUI, and developing the CUI must be involved in discovering the CUI and helping IT identify where it's at, and then help them impart the controls both in the physical realm, the facilities, the workflow, and in the IT infrastructure. These things must work together, folks. If they do not work together, or if you leave it up to Bob, the IT guy, to square you away, you're never going to get compliant, and you should write this section of your revenue right off, because you're going to have a bitter end to a long struggle that will not be fruitful. Okay. And I say that in sort of, humble jarring, in the sense that this is complicated, folks. Okay. And we have to work together in order to secure this information. So let's look at a DoD instruction 5230.24, which is on the whitehouse.mil website. Okay. Not the old version. Not the old version. January 10th, 2023. Not the old version, folks. And it will tell you that this establishes the policy, assigns responsibility, and provides procedures for assigning distribution statements on technical information. Distribution statements means it's controlled technical information, by the way, and establishes the framework and marking for managing, sharing, safeguarding, and distributing technical information in accordance with DoD policy. Okay, it aligns the marking procedures for technical information, folks. Okay, underneath the DoD instruction 5248 and 32 CFR. So if you're familiar with these resources, you will realize that the instruction tells you this document comply with the 5248, which is the cornerstone document for DoD, and complies with the 32 CFR, which I told you is an absolute necessity. So we just have to read this document and understand it and implement it. It's just that simple. That's how we do it, folks. So this document applies to newly created, revised, or previously unmarked classified information and unclassified technical information that is originated or managed by the DoD in an RDT&E program, research, development, testing, evaluation, program, and technical information originated or managed by DoD acquisition and sustainment activities, meaning a DoD contract, including the system, design, development, production, procurement, sustainment, and including the logistics, maintenance, and material readiness and collaboration of those activities. Okay? Everything in the performance of the contract. That definition, and you will, as you read into controlled technical information, consists of 4 very important supporting definitions: controlled technical information, military space application, engineering data, and configuration management that is represented, as examples of technical data, and is represented in any form, tangible or intangible, in any form, not just the ones and zeros, folks. Any form it represents the technical data. Okay, that's what DoD Instruction 5230.24 says. That's the reason why the stakeholders are involved, because they handle the real technical information, which is the piece, the blueprint, the physical representation of that. So remember, I told you that 4 definitions are impactful to understanding what controlled technical information is. Those 4 definitions are on the left-hand side of your screen. Underneath the ITAR and underneath the EAR, part numbers and bills of material are not controlled. They are controlled underneath DoD policy, and it makes sense. What do you want to prevent your enemies from getting so that they cannot reproduce what you're doing? The bills of material, folks, and the part numbers. So when you have information that's unique and related to the performance of a DoD contract, and it forms in the form of a part number that is unique and to the military and space application, unique to the performance of the contract, it is a controlled piece of information. The parts lists and the data list related to the bills of material are an item that contains controlled information, and they must be controlled. Underneath the ITAR, that's not true. Underneath BIS, that's typically not true either. But underneath DoD policy and the definition of controlled technical information, that is accurate and consistent with DoD policy. So that means that when we apply this information to engineering drawings, to configuration management documentation, to engineering data, to associated lists, bills of material, to standards, to specifications, to technical orders, technical manuals, and blueprints, plans, instructions, computer software, and software documentation, and catalog identification items, i.e. part numbers, right? And related to the data sets, studies, analyses, and other technical information that can be used or be used for to design, engineer, produce, manufacture, operate, repair, overhaul, or reproduce any military space equipment or technology concerning such equipment. It is controlled technical information. Okay. Now I need that to sink in. I need that to sink in. Let's take a closer look. So the representations of that data, physical and virtual, the ones and zeros, must be protected in any form. Okay. Controlled technical information consisting of those supporting definitions, okay, and representations of that information in no matter in what form, fit, form, or function. And it says this within DoD instruction 5230.24, must be protected. So the only exception, the only exception to that is information that's a general scientific or mathematical or engineering principle that's commonly taught in schools, colleges, or universities, and that information is in the public domain. That is the only exception to the definitions related to controlled technical information. That's the only one. That's the only one. That's the only one. Okay. Now, if it is a commercial off-the-shelf item, not because you say so, but because it meets the definition and the criteria for a commercial item. Okay. We will be hosting a special CUI presentation just like this one on commercial item determination versus controlled technical information. We will do that. And we will show you exactly how the DoD determines what a commercial item is. Okay. And what are the limitations of that? Because it's a complex process. All right. If it fully qualifies, meets the definition of a controlled item, as described within the DoD process, then that item is exempt. It is not exempt when that item finds itself on a bill of materials, because the bill of materials, including the other portions of CUI, would be CUI. So it's the item that's exempt. It is not the item on a bill of materials that makes the bill of materials exempt. So commercial items are exempt until they come in contact. Think of it like a steering wheel. If I'm building tanks here and I got a steering wheel that's related to that I bought straight off of a GMC motor or motocross or off-road magazine, and I'm slapping that steering wheel on my tank, okay, then that steering wheel is commercial off the shelf. When I put that a steering wheel that I bought off an off-road magazine, and I put that in my tank, and I attach it to my tank, and I put it in the bill of materials, it is no longer that information. It is a COTS item, but that information that contains that information is CUI also. If I modify that steering wheel, okay, for the purposes of meeting the technical specification for making a tank, then the modification itself is CUI, not the actual unmodified portion of the steering wheel that I bought in off-road magazine. Okay. Now, navigating through that is a complex process. It's detailed, and we will cover that in commercial item determination versus CTI in the next CUI special broadcast. What does that mean? That means that commercial items are exempt. Superficial changes, a different color of paint on the commercial item. Well, the commercial item I bought was my steering wheel in off-road magazine, but I needed tan to match my tank. Okay, well, that's a superficial change. That's not CUI. Well, I need to modify that steering wheel in order to attach it to my tank. That modification is not superficial. It's a substantive modification, and that is not exempt. If I have ITAR items, if they apply to the military and space application, if I have unique or custom parts and pieces that are unique to the military and space application, those items are not commercial off the shelf. And again, we will go over this in that special broadcast in depth. So let's bring this together. We got 4 different definitions that include distribution restriction statements. If it has a distribution restriction statement on the, let's say, the blueprint, then guess what? If that says that it's not publicly available, meaning that's not distribution A, statement A, if it's any other distribution statement but A, then it is controlled technical information by definition, because it has a distribution statement on the actual document. If it qualifies to have a distribution statement on the document, but it doesn't have one, then that document is CTI, and you must add the distribution statement to that document that applies. And we'll touch on this briefly. So I need to know out of this process that controlled technical information and export controlled information exists within the commercial items that within the bill of materials that may have commercial items in there that have made custom part numbers. Okay, those things, though they may not be controlled underneath the ITAR or underneath the EAR, they are controlled underneath a DoD policy. That's the reason why you begin to see that elaborate definition that I talked about and those 4 supporting definitions to what, engineering information. That means when we do quality and we test that part underneath the specification, is that information, if that is that information that qualifies as CUI? You betcha, because it specifically says quality testing, right? And evaluation of the part. Okay, non-destructive testing, you betcha. Okay, so if it's in the context of the specification, you're testing the specification and you're creating test information that's associated with that, you betcha, that is CTI. Okay, so now you begin to understand why the proliferation of CUI may be across your entire enterprise, and why it's necessary to control it. In order to uncontrol it, you must understand what it is and mark it properly. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. All that information to finally get to marking. Because if I told you this information up front, you would not be able to meet all the requirements within the context of marking. So in the DoD instruction 5230.24 in the highlighted portion on your right, it says all unclassified CTI must be marked in accordance with a DoD instruction 5248. Period. DoD's the legacy material, including CTI, will not be required to be remarked or redacted while it remains under the control of the DoD under the DoD control, or is accessed online or downloaded for use within the DoD. However, any such information or newly derived information outside the DoD must be marked as CUI if a careful analysis determines that it qualifies as CUI. Who is responsible for that careful analysis? Authorized holders, because that's what DoD policy says. Okay? Unclassified CTI originated by or under the control of the DoD will be marked with the distribution statement. Unclassified CUI that's not technical information is defined in the glossary will be marked in accordance with DoD instruction 5248. Okay? So in the glossary, notice it says, as defined in the glossary. You have to look in the definitions. That's the reason why I said the 4 definitions are important of what constitutes CUI. That's the reason why, okay? And then it provides you the procedures, okay? Which we'll go over. Now, I want to highlight even bigger print. If a careful analysis determines that it qualifies as CUI, okay? Any such information or derivative information must be marked as CUI. Must be marked as CUI. Must be marked as CUI. If a careful analysis determines it qualifies as CUI. Not saying that it's marked as CUI. It qualifies as CUI. Okay? That's what DoD policy says, folks. All right. So instead of beating that drum, again, we're highlighting the fact that, okay, we've got a careful analysis. That's the direction within the 5230.24. Who are the authorized holders per DoD policy? Well, the DoD is an authorized holder, of course. Okay, it comprises individuals, groups, and the agency itself. The prime contractor, absolutely an authorized holder. The higher tier subcontractor, yes, sir, 100%. Yes, ma'am. Subcontractor, you betcha. Every tier below that, did the information qualifies as CUI? Yes, Absolutely. 100%. Okay. Well, what's a distribution statement? That's the first I've ever heard. Now, I'm not going to spend the time and going over in this detail. I want you to show you, though, that distribution statement D is often the most found within the defense industrial base. If it qualifies as distribution D, or it is been or has been marked as distribution D, it is controlled technical information by definition. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's look at an example. We have distribution statement on the left-hand side, Acme Defense. This is a notional piece of CUI. And guess what? That distribution statement is distribution statement D. And by definition, it is by definition controlled technical information because it's in the performance of a DoD contract, and it is the technical data that you described underneath controlled technical information. So guess what? It is most certainly 100%, no doubt whatsoever, controlled technical information. Now, if that happened to be marked as ITAR, and it's got the ITAR export control warning on there, and it's got the distribution statement, but it doesn't say that it's controlled technical information, guess what? It is controlled technical information, and it is also export controlled information as well. But not to belabor that process, it's simply marked as CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, and I'll illustrate this. Okay? So, any information that's not publicly released in a military and space application that is not information that's used as standard academic information underneath the exception is controlled technical information if it fits into the definitions in the glossary in the DoD instruction 5230.24. Those are the definitions in the glossary in DODI 5224. The examples on the right-hand side are those examples of those definitions that are related to the definition of controlled technical information. Okay. Again, applying the examples of the engineering drawings, the configuration management documentation, okay, and the representation of the fact that are they distribution D? Are they distribution E? Are they distribution statement F? If they fit those criteria, they must be marked accordingly. They are not publicly releasable information. Okay, it is not distribution A, and it must be marked. So this is how we bring all of this together, folks. We've got marked and unmarked documents. That's a fact. Most of the documents are not properly marked. That is also a fact. We've got these exemptions underneath commercial items. That's also important. Okay. And then we've got the definitions related to controlled technical information. So it's the context of this information that helps you determine whether or not information qualifies as CUI. There's additional information on the ITAR and export controlled information in 5230.25. That will tell you what is publicly releasable underneath the ITAR and underneath export control restrictions. And you need to read that because if it doesn't meet that definition, then it cannot be released. Therefore, it must be properly marked and protected. And that information is throughout our entire business workflow, and our IT workflow. So let's talk about marking. So marking, we also have to mark the standard form 902 requires us to be used that it's identified within the DoD self-assessment methodology in V.2.1. Okay. It's also there's also a flash drive version of that, and there's other variations of that. Some of them say U.S. government property. The CUI supply produces those that don't have any marking on their ink. And can you have custom labeling? Of course, you can have custom labeling for them. And they're the sponsors of the broadcast. Can they be ordered through the GSA? They can be, but you require special permission to do that. And my understanding is that many federal and DoD agencies order from CUI supply because it's so difficult to get it through GSA. All right. If you have items such as encrypted drives, and this is a compliant encrypted drive, by the way, a compliant flash key that meets the requirements with FIPS 140-2 encryption, you would use the standard marking label. Okay, it is intended to be a small on small devices, not just specifically. It's not restricted to be only on flash drives, but it's intended to be used on small devices. Okay, so if we have technical information, then we have to protect it. How do we mark it? CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, and then we've got the CUI designated indicator box per the DoD CUI marking aid. And then we also have to include, per DoD policy, the two different statements for the ITAR restrictions, ITAR export control restrictions. One is required underneath export control reform, and the other is required explicitly underneath DoD policy. Okay, CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom. Okay, and the CUI designated indicator box. What goes in that? Okay, if you don't know the name of the DoD component, could be the name of the prime contractor. Okay, the office that created the document. That's you, right? That's your organization. The categories related to what's in the document. So CTI, export controlled. Okay, and if there is any derivative distribution statements, you identify and mark that underneath the appropriate line 4. Okay, and the POC of the person responsible for that document in your organization. Sometimes documents are not allowed to be modified underneath terms and conditions. That's not a problem. The CUI NARA office provides a cover sheet, which you can buy on CUI Supply, in the packs of 100. Okay, that can use to cover the document, and you can apply the appropriate demarking information in the actual boxes provided. Okay, that way you do not have to modify the original document. But what you want to make sure is that they are together and they do not separate. CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, the designated indicator box. Again, ITAR, export control compliance requirements need to be on that. We're related to the DoD requirement statement. Okay, CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, and then the CUI designated indicator box. Again, CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, the designated indicator box right there. Okay, but why? Because it has a distribution statement on there. Okay, again, if you have an ITAR document that's not properly marked, what do? You add the CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom. If you're not allowed to modify the document per your terms and conditions, you simply add the cover sheet. In emails, if you're sending email in a compliant fashion, not commercial Office 365, not compliant, you have to follow this marking guidance per the DoD document. CUI in the banner, CUI at the bottom, and then notification in the subject line that CUI is in this email and CUI is attached. You must also put the CUI designated indicator in the body of the email. Okay. If you have an attachment, the attachment has to say in the subject, this email contains CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom. The designated indicator is actually in the document that's enclosed. Okay. Portion markings are allowed, but not required underneath DoD policy for the Defense Industrial Base. If I have a presentation like this one and it contains CUI information, CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom. Okay. CUI at the top. Can I do an individual portion marking for those of you who are born and raised in the intelligence community like myself? Yes, you can. Is it required? No, it is not. Okay, so we're going to spend an extra few minutes before we get to our questions. Remember, we're going to take as much time as we can, and we're going to go over how do we create a controlled environment, because that's important. And we're going to cover areas that include visitors and employees and workstations, identifying controlled areas, covering documents, identify CUI assets, alternate methods for the privacy and consent notification required by the NIST 800-171 requirements, and then monitoring key risk areas for enforcement of the requirements. So we're going to include that and go through that and give you examples. So how do we establish a controlled area? Okay. Remember, a controlled area is where we have confidence that we have the physical and procedural protections in place sufficient to meet the requirements for protecting the information or the system that contains that information. Okay. So it's not just the computer. Okay. It's the entire environment for which the computer sits in. So when we talk about that, what are we doing? We're ensuring that only authorized personnel can access the CUI. And we have to ensure that those authorized personnel are identifiable, number one. And number two is, by contrast, we know that there are people who are not authorized to access the CUI and may be restricted or prohibited. Okay. When they are restricted and prohibited, we need to identify them in some manner. And this is not the way, this is a way to identify them. Okay. And by the way, I failed to mention that there's some new products on here that are exclusive to this broadcast, my understanding, and that are not even on the a website yet. So if you see things in this portion of the brief, just put an email out to the info@CUI Supply, and as soon as they come in and listen to the website, they'll give you the opportunity to buy them. So a visitor restricted badge. So visitor restricted badge means that I have authorized visitors and I have restricted visitors. And restricted visitors are protected. They are prevented from and prohibited from accessing the CUI, viewing the CUI, having access to any system or any item that contains CUI. Okay. And it is the responsibility of authorized individuals to monitor the activity of those of visitors, regardless of whether they're permitted or regardless of whether they are authorized or restricted. Okay, so when we have a workspace, we can sign the workspace and create signage around that workspace, which clearly identifies the fact that this is a restricted environment. And it also differentiates us in the ideas and the ideas in mind of our employees of which areas are authorized to have CUI and which areas are not, which areas are restricted from those CUI restricted individuals, and which areas are permitted to have access to by those that are authorized access to the CUI. Okay, so this goes the exact same thing. Everyone should be properly identified. Yes, I'm authorized to access CUI. No, I'm not authorized to access CUI, so that it's very clear in the mind of any person within the controlled environment who is authorized and who is restricted, what is authorized and what is a CUI restricted. So this is an example. I've got two workspaces, which may very well be because my program or my computer on the right-hand side may not be able to meet requirements, or for some reason we don't want it to meet requirements. So I have a CUI restricted a workspace and a computer on the right-hand side, and it's explicitly labeled that we don't that it's CUI restricted because we don't want CUI contaminating that machine. On the left-hand side, we exclusively identify that this item is authorized for CUI, but this area would be restricted if a person held a red badge, right? We wouldn't want them to be able to view the screen. We wouldn't want them to be able to actually sit at the computer, all right? Because the computers themselves in the work areas that contain CUI, that are authorized to contain CUI, must be labeled, must be identified, and they must also be restricted from access, physical access from anyone who's not authorized to access the CUI. All right. So we have to label them because labeling is the cornerstone for restricting them and knowing how to what are the permissions related to those particular devices. And exactly the exact opposite when we have workstations that either doesn't meet requirements or it's restricted from meeting requirements or it's even prohibited from meeting requirements. Then we want to identify that specific those specific devices. We want to identify those as restricted items, and they're not CUI assets underneath the CMC rule. Okay, we can use other signage, and these are brand new items that aren't even available on the CUI Supply website. My understanding is, and you can seek out if you want to from info@CUI Supply if you're interested in these items. You need to identify network equipment that has CUI, that's marked with the purple labels, and it is restricted from being accessed by anyone who's not authorized. And monitoring the environments and control the entry and exit points, and obviously restrict access to individual CUI media that is authorized to have CUI. This is some guidance, and I would it's important probably for you to screenshot this. And this guidance shows you how is a way, not the way, to mark the devices. And this has got a CUI medium sticker marked on it. It's got the control and consent warning related to accessing the network because, for example, in a small environment, they don't have fancy banners to put on their website. And the DoD has explicitly stated that you can use a substitution like this in order to provide a notice of consent and privacy warning to an individual user. And it's just as fine as actually having the digital banner on the actual network. Okay. It's a controlled asset. Okay. Well, we want to identify those CUI authorized assets from those that are not authorized CUI. And then we're required to establish a baseline configuration management and to manage those individual hardware, software, firmware, documentation throughout the entire life cycle. So we have to identify what are CUI assets, not just on the paper, but we need to identify them in our workspace in order to protect them. Also, and then as mentioned previously, the notice and consent warning. We can use a substitution method if we don't have a fancy banner. We can't afford to have, spend thousands of dollars for an IT person to come in and create a fancy consent banner. It's not necessary. Or maybe we use a virtual desktop. We want to identify the fact that the CUI is only authorized to be on the virtual desktop and not authorized to be on the actual machine. And if you know these requirements well, that's a really great way to protect yourself and identifying the difference between the actual physical machine that may not be compliant at all and the actual virtual machine that the CUI authorized individual works on. Okay. If within my workspace, I identify people, I identify USB keys, I identify the individual assets, the computer monitor, the base, and so on and so forth, that these are all CUI assets contain CUI. All right. And then if I'm in my workspace, and I have documents and so on and so forth, those documents must be protected and covered in order, if I'm not allowed to modify those documents. Okay. And the CUI document covers, you can spend $1 billion on burning up your purple ink, or you can buy them pre-printed. Okay. All right. Last, a couple ones more. If I'm marking documents, remember that I'm marking documents at the top, at the bottom, and that CUI designated indicator box. That's how I properly document or mark a document. And if I can't modify that document because of my terms and conditions or other restrictions, then I use the CUI cover sheet, and then I fill that information in appropriate on the CUI cover sheet. If I'm working in an alternate workspace, that is subject to inspection, yes, it is. Then I can that workspace, like my workspace right now. Notice that I've got visitor tags, I've got authorized user tags, I've got restricted user tags. If I have CUI in my workspace, access to CUI, then that environment is and must be restricted from access from persons who are not authorized, like my wife or wherever, right? So at the end of the day, if I'm using an alternate workspace, the alternate workspace must also meet requirements as well. Just because I'm not at work doesn't mean that I don't have to have the proper controls in place in order to meet the requirements. Okay, so alternate workspaces are important, folks. When I'm handling CUI to ensure that it's not end up being compromised, you can have signs that say, hey, no CUI in the trash, right? Only put it in authorized locations, like right here, right? And ensure, again, like on the left-hand side, there's a stack of documents there, which happens all the time. And guess what? That is not authorized. Those documents need to be secured. Why? Because there's no overwatch there. In this case, there is an overwatch. So we've got a camera that's directly overwatching the container that contains CUI, and we've got active monitoring of that disposal and proper signage to ensure that everyone knows that everything in that purple container and everything dropped there is not trash. It is only controlled unclassified information. All right. And then that container is emptied out and safeguarded and handled appropriately. Okay. According to your procedure and your policy. All right. So handling, meeting these requirements it's absolutely possible to do that, defining the controlled environment. And I hope that the things that we've discussed here are valuable and impactful to you meeting requirements. So let's get to the questions, okay? And we're at 9 minutes over, and I apologize for that. But I'm here for as long as your questions require. So let's go through the questions. So Michael Newman, always ask great questions. So with a report like this, Intelligence and Government from the Intelligence Committee, do you know of any government efforts directed to curtail misinformation, misunderstanding of CMMC? I do not. So listen, everyone, it's America. Everyone gets to have an opinion, right? What happens, though, is that our opinion without due diligence and without homework becomes damaging when you pay me to guide you on what you're doing, and you follow my guidance. I should be accountable and responsible for that information. Now, I love America. We're not here to handcuff people for even yakking or yelling at each other on LinkedIn. That's not the issue. You can do that. This is America. I don't care. But reality, though, is what for those that are not knowledgeable about this requirements, my heartburn is that because you have certified this or certified that, it is the preface or the pretense that you know what you're doing, which in fact, oftentimes, not what they say is accurate nor consistent with the standard. You don't provide citations for what you say. You don't provide the full context of the requirement. You just think that 2 sentences on Twitter or 2 sentences arguing back and forth on some post on LinkedIn, like a trailer park, is sufficient data for a person to make a decision that what you're doing or what you're saying is accurate. Please do not be foolish. Do not follow information that when people are yelling back and forth, it's just ridiculous. Okay. Anonymous attendee says, so I'm in trade compliance. Great. Love export control people. Would be good resource for identifying resource to utilize in identifying CUI. So for the purposes of trade compliance, any information that's export controlled underneath the DoD contract must be protected as export controlled information by the appropriate restrictions and licenses and authorizations, but it must also be protected underneath the DoD policy for protecting that information. Okay. So where would you go? You need to go to DoD instruction 5230.24. Okay. And DoD directive 5230.25. Okay. That will give you the definitive guidance on what constitutes and what needs to be protected underneath DoD policy. Now, the only thing is that underneath trade compliance, remember that you must reconcile your documentation, not just on the ITAR side, okay, not on the BIS side, but also on the DoD side. So at DTC Global, we have export controlled manual, pre-written, and we have that's appropriate for probably 90% of most people, and a pre-written technology control plan. Those pre-written documents integrate both sets of requirements, and that's exactly what you need to do in order to fully meet the requirements underneath DoD policy. Has to apply your export control requirements, apply, and also your DoD policy requirements apply. And so it is difficult to navigate fine-tuning that out, but those are the references that I would recommend. Okay. So DoD instruction 5230.24 and a DoD directive 5230.25. All right. Okay. So would a CNC code be considered CUI? Let me preface that. Okay. So let's go back up and look real quick. All right. Because the answer is in the details. Okay. Right. So let's talk about that. All right. So if the CNC code, okay, is on a military contract, okay, DoD contract, and it's related to the military and space application, meaning you're not making a commercial part. It's related to the specification, the technical information that's identified in the statement of work or the performance, right? That's unique to the military and space application, and it meets the definition of what controlled technical information is, then it is CUI, okay, period. Now, there's an important distinction here. Now, let's, the controlled technical information is CUI. It must be protected. Okay, well, is it an OT device? It is an OT device. Are OT devices required to meet requirements underneath the DFARS 252, 204, 7012? You betcha. Oh, well, I thought that they were exempt. No, my friend, they're not exempt. Okay, well, wait a second. They're not. They can be considered not CUI assets. They can be considered contractor risk mitigated assets. Yes, that's true. And if you know the careful distinction in these definitions, what that is true. However, underneath the DFARS 7012 and underneath the CMC rule, the contractor risk mitigated assets are not exempt. They're not exempt. They must meet requirements. The only difference in the rule is that the rule downsizes to focus, not exempt, focus the attention of the assessor on CUI assets. Your assets are in scope no matter what category that they are in, unless they are out of scope or exempted underneath DoD policy. And if you listen carefully to that 40-minute briefing that the DoD put out just a couple days ago, the video that I gave you in the beginning, I gave you the link to, it makes a careful consideration to highlight that, which is that they are not exempt because they're OT. They're not. They must meet the DFARS 7012 because the DFARS 7012 in the NIST 800-171 R2 at the bottom of the page set in section 1 explicitly states that OT items are in the scope of the requirements. And it also says that Internet of Things items are also in the scope of requirements and must meet requirements. They are not exempt. That is a huge misunderstanding when it comes to scoping, okay, that we'll tackle in another day. Well, I mean, we touched on it today, but we'll tackle it. So bottom line is the information CUI? Yes. Is it CTI? Yes. If we're export controlled information and it represents technical data to reproduce the part, it would be export controlled as well. Okay. So do we have to protect it? Yes. Must the CNC machine meet the DFARS 7012 requirements? Yes. Are they exempt? No, they're not exempt. Are they a CUI asset? No, they are a contractor risk mitigated asset. Are they the focus of the CMMC assessment? No. Are they still in the scope of the CMMC assessment? Yes. And that's the standard. Okay. All right. So what do you do? Let's see. Anonymous asks, how do you ask the DoD to partially mark CUI documents? How to mark a prototype or a physical product or the product itself? Okay, so let's there's some important nuances here. If I so let's go to this right here. If I make a widget and the widget is in the performance of a DoD contract, then that widget is controlled by the DoD. Underneath, in a different brief, I didn't put a part of this. Underneath Raytheon versus the U.S., okay, which was decided last year, the year before, Raytheon took the DoD to court, okay, to sue them because the DoD required them to protect information that they considered not to be under the category of CUI. All right, and they won. But what's careful about that, careful to note about that court case is that the DoD said, listen, your proprietary information is your proprietary information. But if it is controlled underneath the DoD categories of CUI, underneath their requirements, then it is controlled by the DoD. They don't own your proprietary information, but it must still meet the requirements for control, regardless of whether it's your proprietary information or not. Then they also said that if the information does not meet the definitions related, that the DoD cannot assert control over that information. Okay, so your supply chain, not controlled technical information. That specifications related to a prototype that you've developed under the performance of a contract, absolutely controlled technical information. So in order to repurpose that information for sale and to do anything else with that information outside of the statement of work, you must ask the permission of the DoD or have the information decontrolled. Okay, all right. I hope that was helpful. If it was, please let us know. Okay, Abdullah says, hi, Regan. Mythbusters 5 CMC documentation evidence. Yes, I love it. Okay, thank you. Mythbusters is something that we love to do. Can you explain this bullet? Procedures are trained and individuals can execute. Yes. So, Abdullah, if an organization, let's say you and I, Abdullah, are working together, okay, and you're the man. I mean, I just fill in the blank for you. I stand in the shadow of the man, right? I'm new. I don't really know much what's going on, and you're out on vacation. and you've gotten ready for, help the organization meet requirements and done all of this hard work, developed your policies, developed your procedures, worked with the CUI stakeholders, and you as the man are out to lunch, you're on vacation, and guess what? The prime contractor, who are executing 5-day notice audits, by the way, I'll get to that in a second, or the DoD says, hey, we're coming back and we're going to be back in 5 days, and Abdullah is not going to be back, and I've got to answer the mail. Well, I don't know. I know a little bit about the policies, but I really don't know the procedures. And then so when I crack open that procedure, because the guy shows up and asks me about a procedure, and the procedure must contain the sufficient detail for me to execute the requirement and for me to fully meet the requirement in order to, for the remember, there's three criteria. It is implemented properly, it is operating as intended, and it is producing the desired result. That means that I need a procedure that will explain to me as a subject matter expert, but responsible for performing the task, because Abdullah's gone, that when I read that procedure, it needs to tell me how to implement it properly, how to how for the whatever it is to operate as intended, and for how whatever it is to produce the desired outcome. If the procedure doesn't tell me those things and I can't represent those things to the auditor, then I do not meet requirements. So the procedures have to have the sufficient detail that allow me to do that. That's what I mean by that. Let me know, Abdullah, if that helps. All right. So Rodney says, hey, Regan, I have a client that has construction plans. Yep. Okay. That are CUI. Okay. These plans are printed out and are at work sites. Yep. Some of the work sites take pictures of the plans. Yep. That happens all the time to make working easier. Yeah, I totally get that. Do you have thoughts on the best to address this? Can you take pictures or corporate protected cell phones? So let me tell you this, Rodney, is I have a client that does construct. We have one of the world's largest architects in the DoD space that develops the plans, and one of the largest prime contractors that incorporates literally tens of thousands of subcontractors to build these things, right? So the plans represent critical infrastructure, right? They are on a DoD project. They are CUI. When we have the plumbing of the technical drawings related to that project, okay, they are CUI, controlled technical information, or critical infrastructure protection information, okay. And so when I take a picture of that from my cell phone is a controlled device. My cell phone must fully meet requirements, okay. I can only share that CUI with other people who have cell phones who meet those requirements. If I have a printed blueprint, which obviously we do that quite often, the person who handles that blueprint must be fully eligible and fully qualified. That means that if they haven't met, okay, all of these requirements, okay, haven't met all of these requirements here, okay, oops, sorry, there we go. There we go. If they haven't met all of these requirements there, they are not authorized, period. So they must be authorized. If they handle the physical documents, but they don't put it on their computer, do they have to be fully CMMC and all of that? No. But they can be underneath your policies and procedures, meaning the parent company or the higher tier subcontractor. So you don't have to make some poor schlub who's he's the plumbing guy, right? And he just needs the plans to execute. Well, if he's encompassed within your policies and your procedures and you're willing to accept that risk, right, then as long as he doesn't have, the controlled technical information or the critical infrastructure support or whatever the category falls in underneath, DoD critical infrastructure, as long as he only has the physical blueprints and you control those physical blueprints when they're not using them and they're secured in a controlled environment, like what we did for my client is we had the trailer, at every construction site, you see the trailer fully compliant, the IT system within the trailer fully compliant, the printer fully compliant, the shredder fully compliant, right? The process and procedures fully compliant. Contractors that came on site that were going to do some special thing, then they got trained and they got fully authorized and screened right then and there before they could ever access the CUI. Okay. You have to incorporate it in your planning. Yes. Is it a delay? Well, certainly. Of course. But is it required? Yeah, absolutely required. Right. And just now that my contractor, that was my client who did this for critical infrastructure, by the way, said, well, the prime contractor is not even asking for this. And I said, listen, my friend, they will. Okay. Let me tell you what the requirements are. You guys meet the requirements, and then you just hide and watch. Guess what? Literally 3 months after we were done, he called me up, and because we text each other all the time back and forth, even though we're finished. It's just 3 months after we were finished, and he said, Regan, you won't believe this. I said, what? He said, the prime contractor asked us in the middle of the night, updated our contract clause, put the contract clause with all of the details in it, and guess what? Now they're required to meet those requirements and all their subcontractors. I said, voila. I said, did you go back and tell them you're already prepared and ask for more business? And he laughed, of course, and said, of course I did. So the answer is get ahead of the curve, understand the requirements, meet those requirements, incorporate your subcontractors into that. Okay. Make sure they're properly trained and they understand, and you are going to be just fine. And then go tell your prime contractor, go tell the DoD contracting officer, go tell whoever's running that project, we already are meeting requirements. We want more business. And if our competitors are not meeting these requirements, give us their business. Okay. And guess what? That happens. So I'll tell you an anecdotal story, and we'll keep going on the comments or on the questions. So a person that's part of the CMC Industry Standards Council, who's new, she's super squared away. She's an OSC, an organization seeking certification, and she said on CMC in our first meeting, she's telling, we just went through a 5-day notice audits, not from the government, but from the prime contractor. The prime contractor updated in the middle of the night. Guess what? Their terms and conditions, and then showed up literally 5 days later. They blew now they weren't perfect, they're not 110, but they said they blew the audit out of the water, and they were awarded $26 million in additional work because they were prepared to be fully qualified for that work as they continued in their journey. Okay. That is awesome. And that is exactly how you can win. That's how our clients win. Okay. All right. So let's see. Can you see a link to those free documents? Oh, so let me know, Rodney, if that answers your question. Can you send a link to those free documents? I'm not sure which free documents we were talking about. Do me a favor, just amplify that statement. Okay, Abdullah, you're welcome, of course. Okay. How do you ask the DoD partially to mark CUI in document? Yeah, we already covered that. 100-page technical document. Okay, so a 100-page large technical document. A customer wants to take snippets out of the details to price, cuts, parts to many vendors. Now redaction is an authorized method, like it is for secret, right? Like in classified documentation. It is an authorized method. Redaction is an authorized method that you need instruction on. Okay, it is complicated, and it is assuming risk. Okay, because you have to get it right. If you don't get it right, for example, let me give you a real world situation. If I redact a document that contains export controlled information, and I didn't do it correctly, and the export controlled information is compromised and goes to unauthorized individuals, am I liable for the fines and penalties, the steep fines and penalties related to what DDTC does if they find that out? And the answer is yes, of course. So you are responsible to get it right, and you're responsible when you get it wrong on redaction. Now, can it be done? Absolutely, 100%. We help our clients all the time, but it's complicated, okay? And there's a level of detail using export control standard as a guide. And if you're steeped in this, then maybe you're well versed in that standard. But when you have classification determination, and you know that the details within the document make it export controlled, then you don't include those details. But if the information can be redacted and doesn't meet the definition of controlled technical information, then it's possible to do that. But I highly advise you to get highly qualified. This is not for the lame of heart. Get highly qualified guidance in order to do this successfully. And I helped one of my clients do this, and because there were certain reasons why they needed to do it, and it made business sense for them to do it, to go through the difficult process of redacting, because they were in a situation where they couldn't. I won't get into the details, but when they were in a situation where it made business sense, and so we went through the process. Well, we developed a procedure for doing this, highly detailed procedure, and they followed that procedure to the T. And I was fully confident that was withstand any scrutiny whatsoever on them doing it correctly. So that's how I would recommend you follow that. Okay, Rodney. Yes, it was answered what I was looking for. Okay, hey, appreciate that. All right. Well, that brings our time together. If you've been part of this and you found it valuable, please put your comments out on LinkedIn, as much as to my chagrin, because people need to know where they can go to get information that's reliable and consistent with the requirements. And it's helpful for those people who don't know any better, who are perusing LinkedIn looking for accurate information, to know to give guidance, not about the argument, but get guidance on where to go to get accurate information. So we genuinely appreciate your time. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I would love that. Please mention the fact that you are part of this presentation, because I get so many connection requests. And I would just, look, if I can be of value to you, please don't hesitate to connect. And I genuinely wish you the absolute best in meeting these requirements, and for you to be successful, and for this to be the greatest opportunity to expand your market share in the history of your company, and so that you can succeed, so that we can protect this information in the best interest of national security, and so that we can sleep better at night knowing that we have been vigilant, and we are confident that we're meeting the standard, and that we're properly protecting that information from our enemies. So thank you very much. I truly believe that together we can secure America's defense supply chain. And I thank you for your time and attention on a Friday. Have a great day.